Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session regarding the Santa Clara Principles Revisited. In this session, we're going to talk about the Santa Clara Principles and the process that's been going on for over a year and a half now to receive inputs about the Santa Clara Principles from around the world and to revise them so they can be continue to be a living document and guidance for content moderation in the current times. So my name is David Green. I am the Civil Liberties Director of Electronic Frontier Foundation, which means I oversee the organization's free speech and privacy litigation. And I also do quite a bit of work currently on policy work around content moderation, around the actions of online intermediaries to curate the user speech that appears on their sites. EFF has been one of the organizations that's been very closely involved with the Santa Clara Principles, and I will give some background on that very, very shortly. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Santa Clara Principles, the Santa Clara Principles actually was not really something that was planned. It happened quite organically. There was a conference in February of 2018 at Santa Clara University Law School out here in California. The conference was called Content Moderation at Scale. It was the first in a series of conferences. And the day before the conference, a small group of civil society organizations, individual advocates, and academics got together to talk about how difficult these issues were and how and what we needed to try and to talk about the human rights implications of these large companies acting as choke points for free speech and having so much control over global dialogue. And to try and to talk about those. And what came out of that was a set of 3 principles, really a human rights framing for content moderation. And that was in the form of 3 principles. The first principle was called numbers. And this was the idea that companies should publish the numbers of, this was essentially a transparency principle. The idea that companies should publish the numbers of posts removed and accounts permanently or temporarily suspended due to violations of their content guidelines. And at a minimum, that information should be broken down along the total number of posts and accounts flagged, the total number of discrete posts removed and accounts suspended, the number of discrete posts and accounts flagged, number of discrete posts removed and suspended according to the content, and similar criteria to that. The second principle was the notice principle. This is the idea that companies should provide notice to each user whose content is taken down or account is suspended about the reason for the removal of suspension. And in general, we wanted companies to provide detailed guidance to the community about what content is prohibited, including examples of permissible and impermissible content and the guidelines used by reviewers, and then also provide explanation of how automated detection is used across each category of content. And then when providing a user with notice about why their post has been removed or suspended, a minimum level of detail for adequate notice. And we set out some guidance for what that minimum level of detail would be. And then the third principle was appeal, the idea that companies should provide a meaningful opportunity for timely appeal for any content removal or account suspension. The Santa Clara Principles were formally launched in May of 2018. And as we got to 2020, and again, part of because this was in some ways a spontaneous undertaking, one of the things we realized very quickly was that most of the individuals and organizations who had put together the Santa Clara Principles were based in the US, Europe, and Australia, and that they did not necessarily reflect a global perspective. And one of the things we very much wanted was them to have global application, or at least to see whether they could have global application. And so as we came around to the second anniversary of the Santa Clara Principles, in early 2020, we launched we being a group of several organizations, decide to launch an open global consultation to get feedback about the pertinence and applicability of the Santa Clara principles throughout the world, and to try to see if there are going to be regional variations in what a human rights framing for content moderation would look like. In the meantime, what had happened in those 2 years was that the principles had gained a lot of traction. They had become a common talking point in human rights discussions about content moderation. They were successfully implemented by Reddit, at least one large platform, and had several more companies, including GitHub, Apple, WordPress, and YouTube, adopt them in part. And a great number of companies publicly endorsed the principles in 2019. At EFF, we published, we have our annual or some occasional Who Has Your Back report. In 2019, that focused on content moderation. This is a report where we ask companies to meet certain types of standards and then judge them accordingly. And this in 2019 report was dedicated to content moderation. One of the questions we asked was for public was whether they endorse the Santa Clara principles. And many companies said they did. Not so many of them actually fully implemented them. But we found that the Santa Clara principles were having a positive effect on human rights. And that's one of the reasons that we launched, that the 2-year anniversary launched the Global Open Consultation. We had written, now as with many things launched early in 2020, our best laid plans for how it was going to be conducted were we had to be flexible and adjust a bit. We had a lot of the planning we had done was going to be around having multiple in-person consultation sessions at RightsCon in Costa Rica. And as I think everyone knows, that did not happen because of COVID. And we really had to readjust our plans and really start to focus on 2 different types of inputs for our global open consultation. And those were just having people individually submit their feedback in writing, and then also organizing around the world, sessions where virtual sessions, many conducted over Zoom, where people could actually have more of a conversation and talk about these things, and those would be recorded. We set out 15 questions that we were interested in having feedback around. I'm not going to go over all of those questions now, but generally we looked at we looked at whether more detail was needed, whether additional principles were needed, whether we wanted to really better define what content moderation was beyond account suspensions and content takedown. We had several questions about whether the Santa Clara principles had been useful as an advocacy tool or resource, and what type of advocacy people had done around them. We had questions that focused on automated decision-making. And again, also just asking for feedback, generally. We did, we actually had especially considering COVID, we had, I think, we were very pleased with the response we received. And at this time, we also had a much larger group of organizations that were involved in the Santa Clara principles, both in numbers and as well as in global representation as well. So we did receive more than 30 in-depth individual submissions that represented feedback from roughly 18 countries, from Brazil to Kenya to Canada and to Taiwan. And we had real-time group consultations that were conducted by partners in Africa, Latin America, India, North America, and Europe. And what we're going to talk about, what I really want to focus on today, because of the nature of this conference, is the feedbacks inputs we received from Africa, And then after we hear those, we're going to have my colleague Viridiana Alamanti just do some comparative analysis to how those compare to the feedbacks we received from Latin America. And then Barbara Dakalova and I will talk about sort of where we're going from here with what the next steps are in this process of revising the Santa Clara principles. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Tina now to introduce herself and to discuss the consultation session that she organized with advocates in Africa.
Thanks so much, David, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be part of this session. Greetings to everyone who's joining. My name is Tina Power. I'm a senior analyst at Alt Advisory, a public interest advisory and research firm based in South Africa, focusing on public law, information rights, data privacy, and emergent tech in Africa and around the world. As mentioned by David, and by way of brief background, the EFF reached out to us to facilitate online consultation sessions with the aim of getting specific recommendations, responses, and input from various stakeholders in Africa. Along with the African Declaration on Internet Rights and Freedoms Coalition, also known as the AFDE Coalition, we hosted 2 sessions in June last year, in which we engaged with participants from civil society and the private sector who were eager to debate how best an African perspective could be incorporated in further discussions and developments around the Santa Clara principles. So for the next few minutes, I'll be sharing some insights from the African online consultations we hosted. But before I do so, and before I reflect on the sessions and the recommendations, I have 2 quick points I would like to note. The first is that we at Alt Advisory would like to recognize the efforts of the EFF and others in acknowledging the need to find ways to make this process more inclusive and reflective of diverse views from across the world. We regretfully understand that voices from specific contexts, such as those from developing or emergent economies and states, have historically been ignored or excluded. This vacuum of diverse and relevant voices is particularly pervasive in the context of internet rights and freedoms. False assumptions and a general apathy for inclusion have led to serious flaws across standards, practices, and technological advancements. Accordingly, we welcome the efforts of the Santa Clara Principles revision team for enabling these spaces for engagements and reflections as they work towards the revision. The second brief point to note is a bit of a caveat. While we are really thankful for the fruitful debates and discussions we had during the consultations, the reflections and recommendations are obviously not reflective of all voices across our diverse continent and should be understood as the reflections of those who were able to join and participate at the time. But we are confident that the important considerations that were raised will assist the team as they work towards the revision of these principles. That said, I will now turn to how we ran the sessions and highlight the key takeaways and recommendations we recorded. So we ran the sessions in 4 parts. We began with a general discussion and overview of the principles. Thereafter, we delved into issues around automated tools and decision-making. We then considered the principles from an accessibility, rights, context-based perspective, and then discussed the principles as a tool for advocacy. Following the 2 sessions, we found that 3 key observations emerged. The first relates to expanding the transparency reporting considerations that are currently envisaged in the principles. It was suggested by participants that companies should be required to publish regular transparency reports about their content moderation practices, which should include the existing requirements for the number of posts removed, but that this information should be broken down further to include the thematic classification of the posts, the level of viewership of a particular post, and the number of thematic classifications of posts that have been flagged by content moderators. It is worth noting, and something that is of interest to me, that following the consultations, this is something we've observed in other regional contexts. This was raised in the South African context last year, with calls from activists and feminists for intermediaries and social media companies to release data reports in the context of reports of online gender-based violence. And interestingly, a similar point was raised during a FIFA session yesterday around online gender-based violence, in which the panelists reflected on the lack of existing data in terms of reports of online violence. So while the panelists recognize that reporting and analytics is really important, I would be remiss not to mention that they also acknowledge that content moderation isn't going to fix all of society's ills. It won't necessarily stop sexism, violence, xenophobia, transphobia, or racism, for example. And to this end, the participants accepted that content moderation does have a role to play, but that its role is not to be the full and final solution to all of our problems. The second key recommendation, and in my mind, the most important takeaway from the sessions we hosted, relates to accessibility, language, and context. So on a very practical level, participants suggested that notices and appeals processes should be conducted in a manner that is understandable to the ordinary user, taking into account different languages, contexts, and time zones. In addition, the user should be able to respond to notices and lodge appeal in a language they feel comfortable communicating in. Further to this, it was suggested that policy should be available in multiple languages. Interestingly, these very practical suggestions led to further discussions around local contexts, intersectionality, and digital literacy, and I'll briefly touch on a few of these. So first, in relation to context, participants reflected on two key points. The first was the local context around access and connectivity, and it has been discussed in previous FIFA Africas as well as during sessions this year. It is well known that there are serious economic challenges when it comes to access and connectivity in Africa. Accordingly, participants found it useful to mention that any review or notification process should be as data light as possible. The second leg of the context discussions, and a really important consideration that comes up time and time again, relates to social, cultural, and political contexts. The diversity of the African continent warrants appropriate considerations of various contexts and languages. What is offensive and harmful in one place may be harmless in another, and content moderation needs to be responsive to this. So participants raised concerns over who decides what is offensive, noting that a lack of awareness, understanding, and appreciation for different contexts and cultures diminishes the important role that content moderation could potentially play. Second, in a similar vein, participants raised the need for content moderation to be considered through an intersectional lens and raised really valuable points around feminist approaches to technology, again, reiterating the importance of context. Lastly, participants noted that there's a need for increased efforts towards digital literacy in order to ensure that users are aware of and can understand community standards and the terms of reference of different platforms. To this end, participants recommended that policies and processes must be understandable, accessible, and relatable so that all those involved are fully informed. The final key recommendation, which I'll touch on very, very briefly, relates to automated tools. This was quite largely accepted as a welcomed addition to the principles, with participants indicating that it would be important to include considerations around automated tools going forward. So to briefly recap, the sessions were awesome. We had a lot of fun. The top three recommendations were: one, a need for more specifics around transparency reporting; two, contextual nuances matter; three, considerations around automated tools are welcome. We are really thankful to everyone who was involved and all of the participants joined the session. We certainly learned a lot, and we are of the view that the consultations will allow really important considerations to be raised going forward, which will no doubt inform this process going forward. So if there are no questions, that's it from me. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Tina. And I should have said, we do welcome questions as we go along. And we hope to have time, leave time at the end for question and answers as well. So please do send in your questions as they come to you. I'm next going to turn to Linda. We received one of our inputs was a very a really insightful and fulsome submission from the Lawyers Hub. And I'd like to ask Linda to speak about that.
Thanks, David. My name is Linda Bonyo. I am the CEO and the founder at the Lawyers Hub. We work on the intersection between law and technology. So our work is centered on digital policy with a consumer protection focus. We also work on justice innovation, how we can get justice through technology to the various people that we work with in Kenya. We currently work in Kenya, and some of our work is also centered in Nigeria, in Rwanda, and in Ghana. I would love to just highlight a few of the the comments that we made. I resonate a lot with what Tina mentioned. The context really, resonates in terms of the challenges that we face on online platforms, and then also on the solutions that could be needed. I'd want to echo her comments on the cultural context and the language used in terms of even appeal, and in terms of community policies that the different intermediaries, online intermediaries have for their platforms. I'd highlight 4 things maybe that the lawyers have indicated and made mention to during the consultation on the Santa Clara principles. You'll excuse me if I'm not very bubbly today. I do have a cold, and so you'll excuse me. But the first comment on our that we put across was on transparency and accountability. There's increased usage of automated tools on online platforms, either on flagging them down or bringing down that specific content. And so our proposal was that the automated tools should only be used when flagging down content and not in the taking down. There's need for more human moderators on these online platforms. And I don't know that I can go into the specifics, but if you look at, especially the challenges posed by COVID and human moderators, I think Facebook moderators are some moderators are based in Kenya. And during COVID, it was reported that they couldn't be able to even report to work because of the pandemic. And so that meant then that they were not actually able to, review content that is already flagged down by, AI tools. And so you'd find then that, an automated tool would still flag down that content and then take it down without any sort of means of appeal. I'd tie that to a lot of the data protection laws now, for instance, in Kenya, still point to the fact that there needs to be a level of appeal, and automated data processing must ensure there's a human element to it. And so our proposal then was that there must be a human element so that this ties accountability to a specific individual. I think that's really, really important. We see platforms like Twitter as well, really active within the African continent. And so even as we give these recommendations, we were trying to see, what exactly is the problem within the continent and what do we think could solve it. So our submission was that automated tools should only be used to flag down content and not just in taking down of content. There needs to be a human element to it. We also, indicated that around appeals, our second issue around transparency and accountability, that platforms should be required to publish additional information, including number of appeals, whether they were successful or not, and the number of times, content was viewed before it was taken down. I'd give, different examples within the continent where we had maybe incidences of misinformation, and the content is, taken down late when it's already caused, flare-ups. And this was, for us, was, we thought through what happened in Kenya for 2007 with the conflict in after the election, the post-election violence. And if that happened now with the internet penetration and the use of these online platforms, then it would be terrible to have maybe content up 2 hours or 24 hours and then having it, go down. We need to get numbers around how many watched it. And this also applies to countries like Ethiopia with the conflict in Tigray. We still need to, have online platforms really be accountable towards what are the appeal mechanisms, who appealed, what are the numbers, and how many times was this content viewed before any action was taken or it was taken down from those platforms. And the other point that we, sort of commented on was on rules for commercial content. If you see now, we talk about the aggressor as maybe corporates and online platforms, but increasingly individuals are using online platforms for commercial use. There's a report that's just out, I think 2 weeks ago by Mozilla Fellows, indicating, the political influencers within Kenya and how much they make, I think about $10 a day to be able to, for them to share misinformation online around the political landscape. And so that shows you then that the rules for commercial content should, go beyond just for companies, but then also look towards user-generated content in this sense. But also we highlighted that any sort of principles around commercial content should really give consideration to consumer protection. Number two, we also talked about intellectual property and also competition laws to be able to really look into these issues. And also finally, there needs to be some independent review for commercial matters. And I think this I would, and this maybe is debatable, the discussions around Facebook and its, the Facebook Oversight Board, where the same body that funds the oversight board is ideally supposed to, be reviewing its own decisions. It may not make sense. I think it's time to have a global way in which there will be independent review for these violations that happen on online platforms. There's also need for additional data, and I think Tina highlighted this. There's need for additional data. There's need for companies to be transparent in giving us data that on what's happening on their platforms, and they need to go beyond just simply setting the numbers, but also the impact. We need to analyze exhaustively those data sets to be able to reveal these human rights violations that occur on these online platforms. And then finally, I think in ensuring longevity, there needs to be, I think, consistent conversations and evaluations done surrounding the effectiveness of the principles. And I like that the consultations were done, in Africa and different regions of the world. I think content moderation is very contextual. And so more and more there's requirement for, platforms to continue to, hire locally, to be able to get into the language context and also the political context. This, I think I mentioned to a few people from Twitter. For instance, you'd find words like Sasa trending on Twitter. Sasa is just a greeting. But then because a lot of the content curation on social platforms are done by an algorithm, it has no idea as to the social context and the linguistic context within the place. And so I think there needs to be more human involvement, even as we and as platforms actually continue to use automated tools in this sense. So I think those are some of the highlights from the Lawyers Hub submission. We were happy to be part of this, and we continue to engage because content moderation is really a huge part of everything that happens. I think especially for countries like Kenya, for instance, that we rely on platforms for news, we rely on platforms for sometimes even for peace, to be able to get in information that would ensure that there's still cohesiveness within society. If you look at Nigeria and the conversations around Twitter and the takedown of Twitter in Nigeria, you see then that these platforms really offer the key to sometimes economic prosperity, as well as I think political prosperity. Thank you very much, David, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Linda, both for that and for the Lawyers Hub submission. I'd like to turn to Tomiwa now, an expert in this area, for his observations of both his direct observations regarding the Santa Clara principles and their need for revision, as well as any observations he has about the inputs from Africa.
Thank you so much, David. Actually, I became a little bit more familiar with the principles when I got to speak with Professor Land, who I think was also part of the people who were involved in the drafting earlier on. So the first version, and she was one of the members of the panel for my proposal defense. So, and one of the comments that I had made in my defense was, the principles, despite how promising it looked, was very narrow. And for a principle that is looking to focus on a global issue, it is very limited. Basically, taking off from that, I understood the principle to be a document which has a lot of promise, but currently as it stood then, I felt that it was a little bit too limited, both in scope and the application of what it intends to what it intends to achieve with respect to the application. Some of the things, right, that I felt was important at that point, and as we moved on in the consultation, was that number one, the principle in being effective or attempting to be effective must be multi-stakeholder driven. And what do I mean by that? People who are, at least to start with, the people who are most proximate stakeholders involved with respect to, for example, thematic aspect of protecting online rights, people who are actually involved also in online speech governance. And by that, I mean both state and non-state actors, social media companies themselves, governments, national human rights institutions, specifically. I'll get to that very much later. It has to be multi-stakeholder driven, and also it needed to be open. The process needed to be open. Also, it needs to be transparent how the deliberations went on. It needed to be transparent, and as much as possible, also, even though that might be difficult, most of the principles in the document needs to be consensus based. And so far, Tina also mentioned earlier that while this is still not, why this is not everyone's views, it represented, the views of those that participated, and to a large extent, it's somewhere we can take off from, which I completely agree with. In my view, I think that I had mentioned earlier that the document has a lot of promises. And the reason why I said that was because, Barbara would know that, Article 19 has been working hard on an idea with respect to social media councils. And in respect to that, social media councils definitely at some point will have to work with some basic set of, norms. And I feel that if this idea of consulting widely with respect to the principles are taken more, farther, I think the principles have the possibilities of becoming like a charter, that could serve or guide the processes of the council. I'm sure Barbara will talk about that when she's speaking. So I feel that, the principles have the possibility of becoming some of the background or foundational documents with respect to content moderation globally. Secondly, I also think that our concept and traditional idea of what we know about governance, when we talk about platforms, especially governance speech, needs to change. For example, it's a notorious fact. Most of us might not be convenient with it, but it's a fact that what governance speech has moved from governments just coming up with press laws and broadcast codes. They can't do that anymore now because online platforms have now become new speech governance and all that. So whether we like it or not, traditional ideas of how governments regulate sectors cannot apply to content moderation because it is global. The nature of the internet is global. When I post something on Twitter now, everyone across the world could say it, compared to what happens for example, in broadcast or in print, in traditional media. So that, for me, I think is one major reason why governments, specifically governments, need to rethink their approach with respect to governing platforms. One thing I've also, I also came across, especially both in my research and also in talking on ideas with respect to principles, to these principles, is that in Africa, the context is a little bit different. It's a little bit different, particularly because of colonialism. And what I mean by that is this. Most of the ideas or legal principles that relate to speech, those foundations as we know them right now were laid by colonial laws. And these colonial laws are what most countries also use to feed their policies that as it relates to online regulation. So for example, if you go to countries like Nigeria, countries like Kenya, countries like, I think it's Zambia, also the Gambia, you find out that criminal codes that have been in existence long before independence are still in force. And these laws provide for provisions like sedition, false information, publication of false information, criminal defamation. Most of these principles are what find their ways into laws seeking to regulate the cyberspace. So when government, that was why I also said earlier that government needs to rethink their approach, not only, for example, in regulating content, also in terms of legal reform. You cannot think rights respecting platform governance today without having to review and reform those foundational laws. And not just those foundational laws, cybercrime laws, computer misuse acts, all of those laws need to go, especially some, the part that relate to online speech. I also noted that in respect to my research and also after I release the principles, we still have a long way to go. Thematically, for example, the new special rapporteur on freedom of expression at the UN released two important reports this year. One focused on disinformation and one focused on gender-based violence online. These are some of the issues that also need to feed into the principles. And not only those, we still have expression online as relates to persons living with disabilities, sexual minorities, other vulnerable groups. So in respect to themes, content moderation without respect needs to be nuanced, because moderation and expression online does not apply to everyone online across board. So people have different experience different levels of inequalities and injustices online. So, and moderation of the principles also have to take into account some of those nuances. I'd also plan to so some of the things I also found with respect to the principle was that I saw, maybe deliberately or indeliberately, the process sort of mirrored, for example, some provisions in the new African Declaration on Freedom of Expression published by the African Commission. For example, Principle 17, which requires that it needs to be multi-stakeholder in nature. Any kind of regulation that must, in respect to internet content, needs to be multi-stakeholder in nature. Then also specifically on Principle 39, it speaks directly to content moderation and how companies and states must engage. But most importantly, what I think the principles might benefit with respect to my research so far is the direct application of international human rights standards to the principles. And what I mean by that is the substantive standards, for example, the rules, the laws, especially as they flow from the provisions of Article 19.3 on how to limit speech, which I think lies the fulcrum, the challenge which most social media platforms, including governments, also face. And the substantive aspect of applying, the substantive application of international law in that regard. Then also process has to do with the accountability and transparency involved. For example, Linda mentioned earlier that there needs to be more data, and most importantly, she referred to a company like Facebook, being the one determining how it's what speech stays up by establishing the oversight board and all that. So I think accountability needs to go beyond just companies. It needs to be global. It needs to be diverse. It needs to be inclusive. So that is the process aspect of applying international human rights standards. Then also the procedure, the remedies have to be clear, how they are enforced and in what rights are available to online users in cases where there are violations of their human rights on the platforms. But most importantly, and which is where I would most likely end my comment, is regardless of this application of international human rights law, I'm not the first person who would think international human rights law should apply, for example, to content moderation. But what I think would be super useful in applying this law is that actors, proximate actors need to get on board. And for example, in my research, I had highlighted these actors, categorized them into 4. There are internal state actors, internal non-state actors, and there are external state actors and external non-state actors. I'll quickly run through them. Now, the internal state actors are the traditional actors, state government, ministries, agencies, but most importantly, which we miss often, are national human rights institutions. National human rights institutions play a key role, for example, in bridging international human rights law with local context. And most of the time when we speak about content moderation, we miss them. So those are internal state actors. Now, internal non-state actors include civil society that work on human rights in general, and if possible, online rights specifically. So they also contribute to the process of shaping online speech governance. And external state actors are typically the quasi human rights bodies, treaty-making bodies, the African Commission, the AU human rights institutions, and the UN human rights institutions. They would, at the end of the day, be the ones to lead the charge. And with respect to external non-state actors, those ones include organizations like Article 19, organizations like the Business for Social Responsibility, and also organizations like Global Network Initiative, who have attempted in one way or the other through their work to come up with principles, international human rights principles that could be applied to content moderation. And these external non-state actors also include philanthropy organizations that support both advocacy campaigns with respect to online governance. So yeah, I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
David.
Yeah.
And so what I wanted to do, what I thought would be interesting now to do is to ask Viridiana to compare sort of what she's heard and read from the inputs from Africa with the inputs from Latin America. Viridiana was instrumental in organizing sessions to get inputs from Latin America, and in also gathering experts from the region and encouraging them to contribute and be involved in the process as well. And I thought it would be interesting from just a comparative interest perspective to hear, to get some sense of how the concerns that we saw come from Africa, how they compare to the Latin American inputs.
Thanks, David. So hi, everyone. As David said, I'm Viridiana. I work at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm Associate Director for Latin American Policy, and my work is focused on the intersection of technology and human rights, such as privacy and freedom of expression, content moderation, in collaboration with groups and activists in the region. And it's it's not surprising, but it's interesting and inspiring to have this dialogue and see the similarities and draw parallels, considering the inputs that the Santa Clara Principles consultation received in Africa. So we had a LATAM consultation call, and also we received submissions from Latin American organizations. And of course, one of the first issue that comes up, and not surprisingly, is the language and context-based concerns regarding content moderation. So for us, also organizations and people involved highlighted the importance to have policy translated, the company's policies translated and adapted to different languages. The appeals also process related to this context and available to different languages. One other issue that is important is related to no more the geographic or the language distribution of content moderators. The number of people in different countries or dealing with different languages. This is important to understand how different platforms are covering different cultures and languages as well. The concern regarding the use of automated tools and the need to understand more which the different technologies used for different kind of contents, text, images, and so on. And not only if humans are involved, but how is the process of this human involvement to know more about this, to have more inputs regarding this. Another important thing was related also related to language and related to country or local context, to break down information about content restriction and types of violation per country or per language, to be able to understand this context better and make comparisons, for example, inside a country between different languages, for example. Another interesting parallel is related to in the transparency or in the numbers category, go beyond the numbers and to have a more qualitative information regarding the impact or regarding on how also has this qualitative angle related to what is the information that the company provides. Also, I think it's interesting regarding also concerns on disinformation and the commercial use of the platform. Some folks also highlighted that it would be interesting to know when public funds are involved in paying for content in the platform, so transparency about ads paid with public funds. Also to have a greater global consistency about transparency initiatives. So we see, for example, that companies launch transparency initiatives regarding ads or regarding other parts of their services that are limited to specific countries, and they don't roll out for other countries, or they take too long to roll out for other countries. So this global consistency regarding transparency initiatives also appeared in our conversations. Yeah, and in general, the relevance to have the principles applied to different kind of content restrictions, not only takedown, but other ways of restricting content, for example, downranking. So this was also something that appeared in our submissions. Yeah, I think these were my main comments regarding what we received. And it's quite important that we're having this dialogue and we have this process of receiving these inputs, and we'll be able to have, this global perspective in the revised version of the principles. So thanks.
Thank you. So let me give everyone a sense of where we are now. I should have mentioned earlier that the current process for revising the principles. There are many organizations that are involved. There was a core group of organizations that reviewed all the inputs that went in. This was a limited group only because of privacy policy that when we received inputs, we had notified that certain groups would be reviewing them. And so but I do want folks to have an understanding of what those are, so they understand that it's not just EFF in Article 19 who are represented on this panel, but also Global Partners Digital, Open Technology Initiative, the Center for Democracy and Technology, Ranking Digital Rights, the ACLU of Northern California, Witness, the Brennan Center for Justice, RD3 for Mexico, and Access Now have all been very involved in the process. And there's even a larger group that are now working on what are the next steps. And let me give you a little bit of sense of what the next steps are. We have put together a report that brings together all the inputs that we received from around the world. and reports on them, and then also derives some consensus recommendations from them as well. That report is in draft form right now. We've sent it out to review for external reviewers around the world, and are hoping to get those comments back soon. And we've also started work on revising the principles based on the recommendations that have come out of that report. Our plan is to launch both the report and the revised principles at IGF, the Internet. I always forget what these acronyms mean, so I'm just going to say IGF in December in Poland. And I believe we're on track to do so. And in the meantime, we are doing regional presentations like this one, so we can give people an update on where we are as much as we can. We hope to do another one at the Bread and Net conference, which will be virtual, but which is physically based in Beirut in November as well. But our plan is to sort of launch the revision at IGF. I think one of the things we've also learned, though, is that no process for getting inputs can ever be complete. And that we need to have a process or there needs to be some type of process for people continually adding inputs into the principles so that they can remain applicable. One of the things we realized very quickly was that in order for the principles to be useful, they probably needed some supplemental materials to guide people on how to use them. And I also should say that this process for revising the principles was in some ways very purposefully not a multi-stakeholder process, in that it very purposefully did not include the companies or governments among the core planning team. I think for many of us in civil society, our experience and sometimes frustration in multi-stakeholder processes that involve companies, civil society, and government is that civil society, we get talked over quite a bit, and we're given token appearances at things, but our position. So we really wanted this Santa Clara Principles to really be a product of civil society and academia as well. So we did receive inputs from companies, from Facebook, and from one other company who we're getting permission to disclose who they were, although I don't think it will be a problem. I just haven't heard back from them yet. So we did receive some inputs, but they have not been involved in the revision process or the reporting process going forward. But one of the things we did realize was the need to have some supplemental materials to guide both to impact that would address those constituencies. And so I'm going to ask Barbara to talk about the effort to create those materials and what they will look like, and what help we actually need from people to have those come to completion.
Great, thanks, David. So yes, hello, thank you for inviting me here. My name is Barbara Dokalova. I am the senior campaigner of Article 19, and my role is to support Article 19 flagship campaigns on freedom of expression. The reason why I got involved in this project is because we are running a campaign called Missing Voices, which is very much in line with all the recommendations that we are putting forward in the Santa Clara Principles. So it's really exciting to link our campaigns to the work that we're doing now with a bigger coalition. So in terms of the next steps, so we've got this fantastic report, excellent recommendations, feedback from everybody. And as David said, one thing that we wanted to do is how do we actually make sure that different stakeholders use it in practice? So one of our objectives is to really have a strong community engagement and coordination with key activists, academia, to make sure that they are able to comfortably use the principles in their campaigns and advocacy. We also wanted to make sure that the recommendations are being effectively implemented with a clear plan on how by companies and governments. And we want to make sure that there's enough resources that different stakeholders are able to use and have access to make sure that they have all the information needed to take these principles and the recommendations to another level. So as a result, we decided that to complement the Santa Clara principles, we are going to develop toolkits. They will provide practical information and advice to key stakeholders on how the report can be used and how the recommendations can be used in various means. We have identified 3 groups that would effectively use the toolkits, and based on that, we will be creating 3 toolkits one for each of the groups. So we have the broader supporters, the community advocates, the civil society, the academics, that group will be able to use the toolkit in their advocacy. We have another group for the governments. And the purpose of the toolkit is to show them how the recommendations can be used when drafting legislations or policy documents for the companies. And last group is the companies, and developing a toolkit about how we can put pressure on companies to make them more accountable to the recommendations. So in terms of the kind of civil society activists, the toolkit will include practical advice on how to prepare and run successful campaigns and advocacy, how we can use the principles to urge companies to hold them accountable. It will contain information and resources on how to amplify messages that we will be drafting and putting in the toolkit. And I'm hoping that we will also be able to include some information about organizing collective actions, campaigns and advocacy actions for social media companies. And there will be information on how activists and communities can be involved in that as well. In terms of the governments, this is actually one group that we didn't think about until when we actually saw the responses from the surveys. And there were some really good examples of how the original principles have been used to have formal discussions with governments. And so we thought this is a really important group that we need to consider, and they also need a toolkit. So they are an important target. The objective for us to develop a toolkit that allows governments to recognize the importance of the principles, prioritizes key recommendations, and how to make sure that the governments can use them in their laws and policies. One thing that we need to consider is that we do not want to include a model for legislation in the toolkit, but rather provide guided questions that governments need to consider when they are developing legislative documents and laws. And perhaps we will be also including some simple do's and don'ts that need to be incorporated in thinking about legislations. In terms of social media platforms, we want companies, social media platforms, to go beyond endorsement at this stage. We have spent a lot of time, engaging companies. Many of them have endorsed the principles. We need them to take it to the next level. And we're hoping that with the toolkit, we will provide them guidance on how they can effectively implement the toolkit, implement the principles and its recommendations. So we will be looking at encouraging companies to develop roadmaps or implementation plans, and hoping that we will be holding them accountable. What we need to take into consideration is different size of companies. So we have some mature companies, some more of a startups. So we will be putting together ideas on what the scaling up process for startups would be. We need to make sure that what we're asking companies to do is relatively feasible. So not put pressure on them to implement everything at once, but look more at gradual adaptation. So the result of these two, we hope to have the toolkits available by December, when the report will be launched at Internet Governance Forum. And one thing that I would like to discuss with you when we have time is looking more at what would you find useful for these toolkits to do what you need them to do, what we need to consider, include, and etc. They're currently just being drafted. There's still an opportunity for contribution, and I'm very keen to make sure that we take all your recommendations. Thank you.
So we will have time for that discussion now if either the panelists or anyone who's watching want to answer Barbara's call there for what what would be for whatever your role is, what would be most useful? What would be the most useful tool for you in implementing the principles and having them both remain relevant and be an effective tool? So we should have time to discuss that if people have suggestions. I did want to just make some before we did that, have some sort of give some big picture comments. I think one of the things that definitely we heard loud and clear, and which was not surprising at all, but it was still very affirming to hear. One of the major themes, as you heard today, that emerged from the comments was the really strong need for cultural competency in the content moderation system, both in terms of language competency, cultural understanding, regional presence. We heard this over and over again, and it reflected itself in language and in understanding of culture, but also in terms of some of what you could see was some of the concerns are very highly specific, especially the content concerns can be very highly specific to a region. In some regions, there's a great concern for gender violence, gender-based violence online. In other regions, there's a real concern for political oppression of dissidents. In other regions, a very strong concern for perpetuation of caste systems, and so one of our challenges was how do you incorporate all these things into the principles, and what does that look like both as a baseline or high-level principle for companies as well as for a tool for advocates? And is there a role for government in this, or does this remain a sort of a self-regulatory model? The other thing that also became clear, and I think is maybe one of the biggest challenges of a project like this, is the scaling issue. There's a lot of really great recommendations. If you just look at something like notice and appeal, what type of transparency reporting does a company have to do? There's a lot of great recommendations, and also a realization that it's going to be very, very difficult for any but the largest companies and most well-resourced companies to do all of them. So how do we set out principles that emphasize the importance of doing these things, but with a recognition that they may have to be scaled up? And how do you do that? And what does scaling look like? We want a system where there is due process by design, where a company doesn't understand that it has human rights obligations when it enters the market, but we also don't want to discourage innovation. In fact, we want to encourage innovation, and you want to encourage new players to enter the market. So how do you do this in a way where you don't entrench the already large dominant companies, because they're the only ones who have the capacity to actually comply with these mandates, but in a way that where the human rights framing is present from the very beginning. And so that's something that we hope to see, whether the things we're aiming for in the toolkits, especially the toolkit directed at the companies. So we have some time left, and I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but I'm interested from the other panelists, especially Tina, Linda, and Tomiwa, if you have any reflections on these toolkits, and what from your perspective would you think would be useful to see in those going forward?
I'm happy to kick us off on that, if that's all right with the other panelists. Thank you so much for that. It's so exciting to see public participatory processes work and lead to sort of tangible outcomes. It's really exciting to know that it's not just a tick box activity, and there's actually something that's going to come from it, and it's going to make the world a little bit better. So congratulations to all the hard work on this. Toolkits sound really exciting. I think I maybe just have two questions, and I understand if they can't be answered right now, but they both relate to the concerns raised around content moderation generally, and I wanted to know if they would be applicable to the toolkits, and it's around accessibility and language. Will the toolkits be made available in other languages, or will it start off in English, for example, and then change in time? And then in terms of the terminology used, we found, particularly in our context, tech words are complicated and sometimes a bit dramatic. So it's often the worst when you have a toolkit on a digital rights matter and then you need another toolkit to explain that toolkit. So just from an accessibility perspective, maybe could you give us some insights onto how this could be user-friendly to the everyday user? Thanks.
Thanks, Tina. Just to say, in terms of languages, because we communicate in English, the first toolkit is going to be in English, but we are looking at languages as well, particularly like the Spanish, French, Arabic, but it might be not the first thing that will be available. In terms of the terminology, yes, I'm aware, and all the abbreviations and all the things that we use, we need to make sure that it is in language, especially when we are developing a toolkit for activists. We want to make sure that it is quite clear. One idea that I have that I'm going to push to my group doing the toolkit is really make sure that somebody reviews it. Having a proper review from different groups to see whether it makes sense and what we need to change. But thanks for reminding me of that.
Yes, Tomiwa.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Barbara. So, for example, I would like to know, for the toolkit, so what is there going to be like a mapping for actors that will be using that toolkit and what their specific roles would be? And if they're going to be like a mapping of actors, what are the considerations that are going to be put in place? That's the question that I have.
I'm not sure I understand. Did you mean like mapping of actors that would be able to use the toolkit?
Yes, so you referred earlier on to governments also being important, civil society, activists.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, yes, yeah.
So we are going to have kind of these broad categories of actors. We in terms of the recommendations, we will be looking at extracting the recommendations for governments in the government toolkit and extracting recommendations from companies in the company toolkit, being aware that we need to consider all the nuances. For the civil society and activists, we will not have recommendations in terms of how to implement the principles, but more recommendations on how it can be used in their advocacy purposes. So we are not going to provide any more stakeholder mapping beyond just kind of identifying general categories, mainly categories that were where we received examples from the survey findings. So there was already mention of different governments and the companies that use, that our partners and colleagues want to use the toolkit. So we might provide some examples or case studies of how they were used in the past by different stakeholders, but we won't do much more than that in terms of stakeholder mapping.
All right, thank you.
Yes, Linda, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, David. I was just going to highlight, I think, the need for accessibility, because I think now, and I think I've just referred to generally, tech companies, even as we talk about appeals, the truth is, in the continent, these companies are inaccessible. If you want to appeal, maybe I'll give an example. Someone's account was suspended on one of the platforms. And so it took, I think, about 6 months for them to access their account, just because the representative of that company came on a panel at the Lawyers Hub. And then we had to tell him that, please, that's a known person, please reinstate that account. And so the truth is, many people are suffering from the effects of, shadow banning, sometimes just government, reporting accounts falsely, and ordinary people just can't get the access. And we've seen this even for Twitter, where verification is for a select few. And then, so we don't necessarily have verified sources of news, especially in Africa. I think there was, I think, was it a cat or a pet that was verified on Twitter? And yet there are government officials who do such incredible work, or even civil society actors, who still ask for these platforms to verify, their accounts. So I think I'm really hoping that this process will get us to that level of accessibility, where if platforms can be able to generate revenue from Africa and from these jurisdictions, especially in the global South, then they need to also have and put in more human resource and more, institutional support as well for these platforms to be accessible, especially in terms of appeal. And I think we look at this in terms of just not like human rights violations. I mentioned Ethiopia, and we saw the issues that are happening in Myanmar around, the conflicts as well. They still need to have this more and more accessibility for people to be able to say no when there's stuff happening on these platforms and when they need redress on this platform. So I'm really hopeful that maybe this process will be able to get us there. Thank you.
Yeah, those are really excellent points. It's something we hear. It's something we hear all over. I think another something that really emerged from the principles was maybe sort of on a basic level, a need for sort of effective customer support, where that anybody, no matter where they are, has someone who has the ability to reach somebody quickly, and recognizing that a content removal can have very serious human rights consequences, and something that needs to be addressed, right away. And so that was something that definitely emerged. I think it's an interesting point. At what point, when you talk about scaling and when a company should do that, is having that customer service capability something that we should demand of companies right away? Or is that something that maybe it's okay if they grow into? At what point should they grow into? I think those are all questions, and something that really gets to how do you implement these things in an effective way. It's fine to have a bunch of principles, but they're not very effective if they're not accessible to the people who need them. So it's a really excellent point. I can speak a little bit to the toolkits for governments, because I think this is an interesting point. I'm also interested in hearing what others think about it. I think this project would look, I think, as Barbara said, generally, one of the messages to governments is that these are not model legislation, that the principles are not model legislation, and they're not model regulation. And I think, as what we all realize, is that these would look much different if they were. That if we were tasked with writing model legislation, we would probably be approaching it in a much different way. And there are a lot of concerns with taking the principles, which are in some ways very high level and in other ways quite specific, and trying to make those into legal mandates. There's a problem with it on a practical level that I don't know if they can be workable. You would really have to confront the scaling issues in a very, very detailed way. As also that when you start talking about these things in terms of the cultural variations and in terms of the language variations, can you write these things in a way that are going to be legally specific enough? And I think that's a very difficult challenge. So we do see these as not as being a regulatory model, but as at least proposing a self-regulatory model. but also helping governments to identify what's important and what's important to users. And so I think that's where our current perspective is on the governments. I don't know if anybody has any responses to it. I do think that's one of the difficult questions. I know that when Santa Clara Principles were first proposed at the very initial meeting, there were some people, some of the academics and civil society members who were very, very concerned about the effort, thinking that it would inevitably lead to governmental regulation, that we shouldn't even go down the path. So I'm interested if anybody has thoughts about how governments should use a set of principles, or what would be the the best form of the principles from a government's perspective. I didn't prepare anybody to answer these questions, so it's yes, Tomiwa.
I think
I believe we've lost your connection.
Agree with me. It is not, oh, can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you, yes.
Awesome. I'm saying that typically most African governments wouldn't use that principle. And the reason why I say that is based on, past actions. We see how government see social media platforms and the internet in general, and how they've been treating both. And that is where that's based on what I make my claim. However, one way I think the principles will be most impactful for now, things could change, is mainstream, getting national human rights institutions to mainstream these principles into their activities. For example, currently, the South African Human Rights Commission has come up with a draft social media charter. And so far, I feel that that charter would benefit immensely from the principle. And I mean, from what I know, South African Human Rights Commission has done promoting online rights and also protecting it. So I think if we look into that in that direction, it might take a while, but it might start, influencing government positions. Also because NHRIs have this unique relationship with respect to promoting and protecting human rights on the ground. I think that's all what I want.
That's very helpful. Yes, Brianna.
Yeah, just quick thoughts and initial thoughts regarding this, considering more, of course, a Latin American perspective and things that we are dealing with here. For one side, perhaps Santa Clara Principles may be also inspiring for governments in the sense of being more transparent on how they deal with platforms and perhaps the agreements they have. This was something else that appeared in the consultations, the need to have more transparency on the relations and agreements that platforms have with governments. And this could be also something that to inspire governments in being more transparent regarding their actions relating to platforms, but also an inspiration on the best way to deal with the issue of content moderation, not, of course, related to the details on how all the detailed recommendations that we'll have in the report or in the principles. But we see that governmental efforts related to platforms are also related to, or mainly related to content restriction, or to saying what platforms should do or not should do relating to content. And the Santa Clara Principles brings transparency and procedural perspective that is perhaps more interesting. And the way that if governments want to regulate platforms, the way that they should look into this issue and stop looking into deciding which content or should be there or not should be there, and perhaps deal with this in a more procedural and a way. procedural justice way.
Thank you. Yes, Tina.
Thanks, David. Yeah, very similar point, and maybe just to share some experiences from South Africa. I hear you that this is, yeah, definitely complicated and you don't want to go down the wrong roads because the consequences could be quite scary. But I think the way Barbara explained it as an informative tool rather than a this is how you must do it is really important. And I think governments are really in need of that right now, particularly when it comes to internet rights and freedoms. This is a novel space for a lot of people, and just having a bit more of an understanding of what's going on can be really helpful. We had an engagement last year with South African Parliament on online gender-based violence, and the parliamentarians welcomed our submissions and asked us for more information because they were just really grappling with what all of this meant and how it worked and what they could do and what they can't do. So I think toolkits like this that are informative rather than suggestive can play a really useful role, and governments must govern. That's their job in the main. But I think if it's phrased that way and it's just to empower and enable, it can be really impactful. So I like the way that was explained, and I think there is a lot of utility in that element of it. Thanks.
Linda, I don't know if you have any. I'll give you an opportunity if you have any comment as well.
Yeah. Thanks, David. I think with governments it's very tricky. We have been working with the government here and made submissions to the Senate on various issues on data protection, sometimes on the digital economy. And my view, and also even at the African Union level, with the current policy framework data policy framework that's ongoing, my view with government is is not to be prescriptive. I think Tina has said that, but then also is to really focus more on what would offer better information and value, and to take cognizance of the fact that there's a skills gap, even amongst people in government who maybe by coincidence or by party positions, then they land at these positions that maybe they don't qualify for or are not exposed to. And so then they have to still come up with regulations. And also I think Tomua said this about the political context as well, which basically means that, you don't take any sort of action or come up with principles that are supposed to be enforced, that will not work. And maybe my best example, as he spoke, I kept thinking about why exactly was Twitter banned in Nigeria. It was just because the president's tweet was put down. And so that tells you how personal this sort of regulations or principles eventually can be. And so I think for me, with government, it also coming from a global context would not be, the better approach, but then the principles that have actually been adopted by local actors and people that governments do not consider combative. Like, for instance, I think, David, you started by saying about, sometimes civil society, we speak to ourselves as well. One of the learnings we had at the Lawyers Hub was that anytime we stood across the fence and shouted at government, nobody had us. But anytime we came up with alternative law, we came up with trainings and skills gap, and they always listened to us when we came in that way. So I think for Africa, it's really, really contextual, and then you have to look at the politics of the day. There are countries like, even up to date, you look at the Malabo Convention on Data Privacy. It still hasn't got the number of countries to get it to law, in that case. That tells you that even though there may be the goodwill, states may just decide to peep and see, but then do nothing about it, which we hope is enough for them to at least get in a bit more of information on what they could do. But in terms of adoption, that may be a challenge.
It's a really great point. I think I see the same problem. We see it in the US as well. I can tell you that we've seen efforts by a few states to impose transparency and appeals requirements on the platforms, and the problem is not so much with those requirements, some of which are very sensible and would be really good practices. The problem is that they come from a regulatory position, of a highly retaliatory regulatory position, where it's the government responding to a specific decision they don't like. We had one very prominent one in the US, and then seeking to just throw a bunch of regulation onto the companies as a punitive measure. And that's not where we think so you tended to see these types of requirements wrapped up in very punitive measures, which I think tend to have and raise a concern that the net effect is not going to be a pro-human rights effect, but really just government finding more levers to control speech platforms. And so it's something we're very aware of, and we're dealing with in the US now as well. This has been a really great conversation. We've covered all the ground I'd hope we would cover, and we only have a few minutes left, so I think it's fine to wrap up. If anyone has any closing words, I'm happy to have time for that. I can just say that, and maybe I'll ask Barbara this question. We are still in the process, and there's still some work to be done. And I think we welcome those who have some time to give and want to be involved in helping us wrap up this problem. We welcome that involvement. I think, Barbara, on the toolkits we could still use a few. There's still space for others to assist. There's plenty of work to do. So if there are those who are interested, Barbara, is that correct? I want to promise.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're very keen to get more feedback into developing these toolkits or just reviewing them.
So you can certainly email me at davidg@eff.org, and I can connect you with those still working on things, whether that is helping on the toolkits or even being part of the group that is coming up with the new set of principles. Again, there's plenty of work to be done, and we really want to make sure that we are having as many voices involved in that process as we can. So unless anyone has a closing remarks, I think I'll wrap it up there and say thank you very much. This has been really beneficial to me, and very interesting. And if you are interested, I perhaps should have said at the beginning, but there is a website for the Santa Clara Principles. It's santaclaraprinciples.org. And it currently has the existing version. It doesn't have the new version, but at least you can see what was originally done in 2018, and to give you a sense of what we're building off of. And so thank you everyone so much. And I look forward to continuing this conversation in other forums. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.